It was the day after Christmas, 1996, when JonBenet's family discovered she'd vanished. A ransom note left behind. Her mother, Patsy, called police.
It was a case that captivated the world and kept a grand jury deliberating for 13 months on whether to indict JonBenet's parents for her murder.
I really think that it is an intruder, and it's looking more and more like that all the time.
Let me make a point that there is DNA in this case.
Okay.
It is unidentified male DNA, and it excludes every member of the Ramsey family.
It does.
I think that is the most important thing for people to realize.
Yeah.
Is it?
Is the DNA really the most important thing for people to realize in the Ramsey case? We hear a lot about the DNA, especially from John, and once upon a time by DA Mary Lacey, the one who exonerated the Ramseys based on DNA in 2008, and the one who accused falsely the admittedly creepy John Mark Carr. And I see this sort of commentary in the comments constantly. But the DNA.
That DNA that was found on JonBenet's body, on her underwear, could solve the case.
Try to explain away unidentified male DNA in a sexual assault case.
They took DNA samples from you, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Battle for access to the DNA of the unknown male found on JonBenet's clothing.
This Colorado Bureau of Investigation report shows that tiny amounts of DNA were found under JonBenet's fingernails and in her underwear. And that DNA did not match John, Patsy, or anyone in the Ramsey family.
What we think is important, and that's use the latest DNA technology.
Tripta Muth saw the evidence differently.
How likely is it that it would be anybody but the killer? I think it highly unlikely that it'd be anybody else but the killer. As of January 15th, 1997, there was a strong suggestion by the DNA results that the Ramseys were not responsible for this murder.
When I look at this case, I see a mountain of evidence that we have. I see that we're in this golden age of forensic science, that we can apply new and advanced technologies to finally solve this case. So I'm very optimistic.
Oh, a mountain of evidence. Whatever happened to the we do not have
sufficient evidence to warrant the filing of charges
at this time? Mind if I do a little statement analysis on that? It's interesting that he doesn't say the evidence is insufficient. Instead, he says we do not have sufficient evidence, which is like saying we don't have enough evidence. That is simply an unfathomably ridiculous comment to make about the Ramsey case. There are files and files and files. There are mountains of files in terms of evidence in the Ramsey case, like nothing you will ever see, probably again, in any other case.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, at last I'm doing a rebuttal of the whole DNA argument. I think a lot of the time when I don't answer it, people think I don't have an answer to it. The reality is that I've kind of, how many times must you make the same argument over and over again? So hopefully this argument will cover the next couple of months until people lose their memories again on this topic. So in this analysis, let's examine 10, not 1, not 2 or 3, 10 cogent criticisms of the DNA evidence that apparently proves the intruder theory, yet can't seem to identify him. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Number 1, the it's a DNA case myth. So if you're putting up your hand and cheerleading this whole idea that DNA is going to solve this case, what you're essentially saying is that it's a DNA case.
The answer to who killed JonBenet Ramsey lies in the DNA evidence.
Now you'll notice all the arch apologists for the Ramseys all say the exact same thing. They all want you to believe this one piece of unknown evidence, not known evidence, unknown evidence. This one piece of unknown evidence is the answer. And once this unknown evidence comes to light, it, and this is the important part, could solve the Ramsey case. But guess what? It could also not solve it, since we don't know what this evidence actually is. Now, forget about the evidence we do know, all those mountains of insufficient evidence, right? Let's throw that out and make this entire case about this tiny smidgen of DNA evidence we don't know. Yeah, that makes sense. And so what we're dealing with here is a reductionist approach that oversimplifies the Ramsey case. It's also a gross distortion of the reality of this case. We saw Amanda Knox beat the charges against her by using exactly the same tactic, that her case was a DNA case. Throw out all the other stuff, all the other messy, difficult things that you would otherwise have to explain, including an alibi. And so all they have to now do is prove contamination, dispute actual DNA evidence found, including her boyfriend's DNA found on the victim's bra clasp. And suddenly Amanda Knox was innocent. Strange that Amanda Knox's own DNA wasn't found at the scene when she lived there. Does that mean she didn't live there? And before we go on to number 2, just one more intertextuality that'll help you appreciate what absurdities we're talking about here. If Richard Allen, did you follow that case? If he was found guilty of the double murders in Delphi, Indiana, right? He's just been sentenced to 130 years for that. If he had convinced the jury that his case was a DNA case, he wouldn't have been convicted. He wouldn't have gotten 1 year's sentence. We know he was at the scene. We know he washed the victims and staged the scene. We know he left a cartridge at the scene from a firearm found in his home. So if his DNA wasn't there, does that mean he wasn't there when he admitted he was there in the area at the time? That is what you get when you narrow down everything to a DNA case. You get tunnel vision, the exact same thing that John Ramsey accuses Boulder PD of perpetrating when they apparently only thought of them. Now he wants everyone to have tunnel vision regarding the DNA evidence. Number 2, the DNA evidence is new and could break the case, and that is also a myth. Let me ask you a question. Put up your hand right now if you think the DNA evidence, this whole idea that, wow, DNA could actually break the case, is that new in the terms of the JonBenet Ramsey case? Did you hear Trip to Muth saying a few moments ago that evidence that came out in January 1997, basically 2 weeks after JonBenet's death, had already convinced him that the Ramseys were innocent? And he was one of the investigators who questioned the Ramseys.
In the JonBenet Ramsey case, what we used is what's called touch DNA. Historically, most of the DNA samples that are taken from stains or fluid, semen, saliva, hair. Touch DNA is taken from a spot that you can't see. There's no.
Anyone have any idea how old this interview is? Anyone have any idea? It's 16 years old.
And what we did in the JonBenet case was we took the long johns that she was wearing and concluded that the perpetrator had held it at certain spots, and we scraped those particular spots on her long johns with a sharp instrument, and were able to get enough cells to get a DNA profile of a male unknown because he's not in any database.
Now, I'm not sure how good your grasp is of the English language. Mine's not terrible, but it sounds like he's saying they got a single DNA profile of one individual there. Isn't that what he said? If that is what he said, is that accurate in terms of Bode Labs' own report?
Well, what it shows is that someone, not any of the Ramseys, DNA appeared in 3 places. in a blood stain on JonBenet's panties that was taken in 1997. And then this most recent, in 2 other spots, the same male profile was found on the long johns where we believe the perpetrator pulled them down from JonBenet's body.
Do you agree that he seems to be referring to a single individual from this composite profile? Now bear in mind, it's already a composite profile of JonBenet's DNA and someone else, very small sample, but he seems to be implying that it's one other individual. Is that accurate? So please, this whole DNA evidence thing isn't new, and if it could break the case, well, it could have broken the case for the last 28 years. Is it going to maybe break the case for the next 28 years? Number 3, suddenly the crime scene wasn't contaminated.
Your docuseries also hones in on the contamination of evidence at the crime scene.
Funny how the contamination favors the Ramseys, but it doesn't favor the intruder. So, if you identified an intruder, then, and I don't think they ever will, but let's say they did, and he was put on trial, I think the intruder could make a really good case for contaminated evidence, just like Amanda Knox did. Now, if there's evidence implicating the Ramseys, it's contaminated. If there's DNA evidence of an intruder, it's perfect. Number 4, DNA wasn't brought up at the grand jury trial. You hear this a lot. Is that true? DNA wasn't brought up at the grand jury trial. So effectively, the grand jury trial is irrelevant because they didn't deal with this crucial deal-breaking evidence, which came up in January 1997. When was the grand jury trial? 1998, June 1998 to around about October 1999. Let me repeat, DNA wasn't brought up at the grand jury trial. Actually, it was. And let's go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town for some additional context here. With the grand jury start date just 3 weeks away, so they decided to convene a grand jury, and it's now just 3 weeks away. Bill Ritter recommended Mitch Morrissey, who understood DNA. Whoa, I think I'm missing something here. So with a grand jury trial about to start, what they're doing is now they're getting some really big hitters, prosecutors who understand DNA. So the DNA narrative definitely was part of the grand jury investigation. So the grand jury did hear evidence on the DNA. So if the DNA is this big deal that's going to break the case, why didn't it break the case? Why didn't it convince the jury one way or the other? Why didn't it convince the jury of the intruder theory? From his office, Bob Grant said that he was willing to loan out Bruce Levine, his chief trial deputy. Levine had the reputation of always doing the right thing in a case. Let's just jump ahead a little bit. While several of Mitch Morrissey's colleagues considered him unremarkable in the courtroom, he had handled 5 rape and murder trials where his presentation of DNA evidence had played a major role obtaining convictions. Morrissey was resident specialist on DNA evidence with the Colorado District Attorney's Council and was often called upon to teach his expertise to prosecutors. So please don't try and make the case that whatever the DNA evidence that was presented was done so in an amateurish way by people who didn't know what they were talking about. Also, please don't make the case that the grand jury simply never heard this evidence. Let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Now the jurors started giving out assignments to the DA and Boulder PD. So the jurors are actually giving out things that they want to know, things that they want investigated, such as, guess what? DNA. Test the DNA. Tell us about the DNA. Quote, they wanted more DNA samples taken from friends and associates of the Ramseys. Newer methods of testing DNA, not existing 2 years earlier when the case began, were now available, and the DA began to run many of the past forensic tests all over again. The grand jury felt more investigating needed to be done. As one grand juror put it, the work on this case is not over yet. In May 1999, upon request, the Ramseys brought their son, Burke, back to Boulder to testify before the grand jury. Now that sounds to me like, in the midst of all of this DNA evidence, the jurors, the grand jury, requested Burke to return to Boulder so he could testify. And then there's this impression of, after appearing for a full day on the witness stand, Alex Hunter seems to almost intervene, and he clears Burke of any involvement in the death of his sister. So think about what's going on here. The grand jury want to talk to Burke, and Alex Hunter basically says, this is the situation. Number 5, how was John Mark Carr excluded as a suspect? Anyone know the answer to that? John Mark Carr was also mentioned in the Netflix docuseries. He was also identified by former Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey, where she basically accused him of being JonBenet's killer. And after a long circus, very embarrassingly, he turned out to be innocent. He turned out to have an alibi. But how, other than the alibi, was he excluded as a suspect?
But his DNA wasn't a match, and he was never charged.
Okay, so I thought this unknown DNA is the only sample. So if it's unknown, how is John Mark Carr excluded? Well, wasn't he excluded based on known samples? Well, because they have other samples as well, including samples loaded years ago, right in the beginning, into CODIS. Number 6, the DNA sample may be a composite of more than one individual. And this is what they never tell you. If you developed a profile, and it was a profile of 2 people, you would never, ever find them if you were looking for a single individual. And if you did that, if you did put that profile into a system, and you waited for a bingo, well done, you would wait 28 years and you would find nothing. And you will wait another 28 years and another 28 years into infinity, and you will never find anyone if the profile you've loaded is of a composite profile, meaning of more than one individual. Well done. You just used forensics in DNA to snooker yourself simply because you don't understand it. Going back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, quote, on November 14, the grand jury met for the 14th time. That week, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation leaked to a journalist that the DNA of a second person and possibly a third person had been discovered on JonBenet's underpants. Even though the police and the CBI had known this since February 1997, the CBI was now using a new PCR 21 band DNA testing method in the hope of finding a match. So again, can you see that this is not new evidence, and it's also evidence that was not unknown to Boulder PD or the CBI. What's also interesting is at the time of all of this DNA testing, the Ramseys approached Barry Scheck, who hadn't been called by Hunter's office at that time, but then he later went on to Larry King and said he declined any association with the Ramseys. That in itself, I think, is quite interesting. Number 7, a sample that doesn't include the Ramseys doesn't necessarily exclude them. And Juror 13 and Cotton Star have written quite an interesting blog post on that topic. I'll put a link to that in the description.
In 2008, the entire Ramsey family was officially cleared. New DNA testing supported the theory that an unidentified male intruder entered this home and murdered JonBenet.
All of this happened way back in 2008. How long ago is that? 16 years ago. So is this new evidence? Is this a new way to investigate the Ramsey case? JonBenet's DNA is in that mixed sample, so I'm not convinced this tiny sample does exclude them. But what about the DNA samples that don't exclude them? Has anyone here read the full report from Bode Labs? Number 8. Is there an innocent explanation?
When I heard the chief's explanation that it was a Chinese factory worker, probably, I was rolling on the floor laughing. It was the most ludicrous, far out there, maybe it was this theory I've ever heard.
9 wants to know, and the Daily Camera took those same lab results to forensic experts. The first time that data had ever been independently evaluated. And those experts agreed. The DNA results don't come close to proving that an intruder killed JonBenet.
And this is from not 16 years ago, 8 years ago. So who's right? Which story is true? Which story is accurate?
It's certainly possible that an intruder was responsible for the murder, but I don't think that the DNA evidence proves it.
The only way I can describe this evidence is uninformative.
What about the contextual evidence, the fact that JonBenet was changed out of the underwear that she was in, wiped down, etc.? And so surely the underwear that she's wearing, that underwear that she's tested, is contaminated in and of itself. So how can you test that kind of thing as a legitimate test? So evidence comes from an item arguably used as staging. Let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. A D1S80 DNA test showed that the stain came from at least 2 different sources. After receiving the report, the police contacted the parents of JonBenet's playmates to see if any of the children had ever exchanged clothes with her. Now, there's another way for a potentially innocent explanation. A child in their pajamas or a child lying on a carpet playing with toys with a whole bunch of other children, and JonBenet was at a Christmas party just 2 days before her death. She went to a series of dinners in a number of homes just hours before her death. Number 9, the new DNA narrative, which is really an old narrative, trumps the grand jury indictments narrative, well, with the help of amnesia and a couple of massive lawsuits, $750 million against CBS and $150 million against Werner Spitz. It is interesting that the intruder only left one piece of tiny evidence that apparently also contains someone else's DNA as well. By the way, is that person also an intruder? So were there 2 intruders who somehow managed to leave no other traces of themselves? No shoe prints, no fingerprints, no fibers, no witnesses who saw them, and after writing the ransom note, they also forgot to kidnap JonBenet, and then they forgot to call and collect their ransom. Number 10, the Ramseys would like this case to be solved. The death of innocence focuses on the Ramseys wanting to clear themselves and restore their own reputations. But if that's what they wanted, if they wanted this case to be solved, why did Burke take 20 years to give an interview and he's never given one since? Is it a case that some of the Ramseys want the case to be solved and others don't? What about all this stuff? Shielding, lack of cooperation, inconsistent statements, and still blaming Boulder PD today while still not really talking to them. This doesn't indicate to me a genuine desire to catch JonBenet's killer. Is there any DNA or fibers or shoe prints, palm prints, hairs or handwriting or any other evidence that implicates the Ramseys? It's okay to say, well, is there DNA that exonerates them? Great, okay. Well, is there any DNA that implicates them? What do you think? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.